Okay, Chapter 1, The Mystery of Being. Another summer has become a part of the past. Autumn's slowly changing leaves and golden sun-warmed chrysanthemums have been rudely blotted out by a covering of snow, an unwelcome winter storm having arrived before it was expected. On white-capped, ruffled Lake Geneva, duck families are bobbing bravely along, close to the walls of Castle Chillon, with dignified swans gliding behind them. Standing on the shore near the castle, I find myself wondering how many generations of ducks and swans have given life and beauty to this lake scene. How far back did their ancestors go? And when did they first arrive on this lake? Scarcely aware of the winds buffeting, I turn my thoughts to the parade of human beings whose lives centered in Castle Chillon through the ages. How temporary and insignificant our short lifetimes seem as I think of the centuries of people who have been born, married, imprisoned, or lived princely lives there. If the castle walls could communicate, what fascinating tales they could tell of the stream of inhabitants, their individual hopes and fears, their ambitions and schemes, their noble desires, and the wicked plots in which many were involved. Tourists from Japan or Germany, Australia, or America visit this castle daily. To think that in 1150 it was being taken over by the dynasty of Savoy rather boggles the mind. This castle has been an arsenal as well as a place where taxes were paid in grain, hay, wine, and fish, and where the defense of the countryside was carried out. Remembering all that impresses me with the impossibility of recounting the complete history of one such piece of ground on the earth's surface, let alone of tracing the history of the human beings brought together in such impossible ways from so many geographical spots, human beings whose very being is dependent on so many other people's lives and choices. I interrupt my reverie to walk to the dock and board a lake boat with my husband. As we sway and pitch in the storm, I resume my look backwards in time, blotting out the highway, the railroad, the paved roads, and the apartment houses, homes, and buildings of Vétoux and Montreux, seeing the rounded promontory of rock-based land jutting out into the lake, providing a place between the lake and the sharp rise of dark mountains to hold off marching armies. I imagine enemies attacking the castle from a fleet of boats on the lake or from the narrow lake road, their assaults thwarted by arrows flying from the holes built in the castle walls. What vivid parallels we can draw from history to show how things that stand out as central to us went unnoticed by the people who were living the events. Visitors to Castle Chillon, whether you or our family during our reunions nearby, always spend time walking around the pillar where Francois Bonivard was chained by the Duke of Savoy from 1530 to 1536. What impression did Calvin, 21 years old in 1530, have of Castle Chillon? Do we think of how close Geneva is to the Castle Chillon and that Calvin was writing his institutes there and Erasmus was dying as the prisoner Bonivard spent his sixth awful fettered year? In that same period, Luther was waging his courageous war for truth in Germany. With Vienna under the shadow of a Turkish assault, he was writing the hymn we sing so lustfully, "A Mighty Fortress is Our God." Didn't we sing that this morning?
We did.
That's awesome. Michelangelo was also alive, painting and sculpting the works we marvel over. But how many of his contemporaries were really conscious of what fantastic fruits his incessant labors were producing? Right in the nearby church of Aigle, Guillaume Farel, whose dates parallel the prisoner's, was preaching the truth of salvation by faith in Christ without works. He preached the same message in the 11th century church in Olan, where our 4 children and now one of our grandchildren have all had their weddings. When Farel traveled to Geneva by foot or horseback, he had to pass Castle Chillon and look at it with some thoughts in his head. We know that in 1536 he was in the midst of persuading Calvin to stay in Geneva rather than to go back to Strasbourg. In March of the same year, 2 big boats and a few other vessels under the Bernice, aided by Geneva, attacked and took over Castle Chillon. the Bernice bear taking the place of the arms of the House of Savoy on the facades. I wonder when Farrell first noticed the Bernice bear on the castle. A parade of years, a parade of people passing by, living in, being imprisoned in, being fought in, being entertained in Castle Chalon. Can we feel the impossibility of thinking of these people, of imagining their feelings with true understanding? Chalon saw many trials for witchcraft in the 17th century, as well as other trials during the time it was a court of justice. It became a prison again in the 18th century. On August 31st, 1792, Fernand Antoine Rosette and Georges Albert Muller de la Motte, two Vendois, accused of taking part in a revolutionary banquet of the Jordiles, were condemned to imprisonment in Chalon. Their sailboat left Auchy the same day. They arrived at the castle the next morning and remained there until January of the following year. But if you have taken a lake boat from Auchy to La Sagne to Castle Chalon, you have had a ride of about an hour and 20 minutes, after which you strolled happily around the castle, watching the ducks or taking pictures. As an aside, I don't know how to pronounce any of these names.
You're doing wonderful.
Thank you.
We don't know, so we assume you're doing it well.
Okay, good. The prisoner, Rosette described in his memoirs the cell in which he was confined. This cell was number 12. It was vaulted. When they had closed the 3 doors, I figured out that it was 12 feet long and 8 feet broad. The furniture consisted of a bed and a wooden chair. The daylight could hardly penetrate, and in order to read, I had to climb on my chair and raise myself up to the grille through which dim rays reached me. Did the people in Chalon know about what was taking place in Germany, one wonders? Johann Sebastian Bach, from 1685 to 1750, had lived, written his music, which is as alive today as it has ever been, and died before the last prisoners spent their sentences in Chalon. In the 20th century, Bach's music is played during music festivals in a romantic great hall in the castle, and some of our own grandchildren had the experience of hearing it one very special moonlit night. But how many people living in Germany at that time Bach was composing heard the sheer wonder of that gorgeous music with their ears, or felt it flow through their whole beings? Only those of Leipzig St. Thomas Lutheran Church, which had a new composition of his every Sunday of the year, as we expected part of their worship service, and very few others. Were they filled with awe and thankfulness for being the ones to worship God with such fabulous waterfalls of praise splashing over them? Many of us would like to be able to slip back through the years and sit in a pew in that Lutheran church to listen to Bach play week after week. Do y'all remember what book that was that we read about Bach? It was like a kid's book, a little thin one.
Was that
about him composing?
No.
I think it might have been with your Logos curriculum, Collie. Do you remember that? No. I think it was boring.
Okay.
Yeah, but it was informative. Would we have been conscious of what really was taking place in that service? How astonished Bach himself would have been to know how widely appreciated his music would be one day. During his own lifetime, only a few compositions were ever published. Faithfully, he continued what he was doing, believing God was sufficient, with a sufficient audience. 2 really opposite things astonished me at the same time. First is the fact that people living at the same period of time of history, working, agonizing, discovering, creating, slogging on in mundane work, suffering, pressing on toward defined goals, or muddling in confusion, have not discovered each other, whether across the street in another end of the same city or across the borders of countries. How unlikely it is that John Bunyan would have sung his hymn, knowing that the prisoner in Chalon was being a faithful pilgrim when he, Bunyan, was 8 years old. He who would valiant be 'gainst all disaster, let him in constancy follow the master. There's no discouragement shall make him once relent his first avowed intent to be a pilgrim. After John Bunyan, 1628 to 1688. Yet there's also the fact that people who were limited in the number of people they could communicate with in their lifetime, or whom they could come to know, were without then realizing it to be a priceless help to generations to come. What encouragement has come to each of us, to Fran and me, as well as a myriad of others, through the sheer courage, the comfort, the inspiration, and determination to carry on that is given by the lives of people unknown to their contemporaries, yet closer to us than some of our neighbors. What a surprising phenomenon this is. To write about one person at any point in history, no matter how interesting that one person is to you, and to attempt to give some true picture of that personality or life without giving a setting of the whole family and the people involved with him or her, would be like taking a tiny hook and trying to pick out one strand of yarn from the middle of a gigantic tapestry. One could perhaps unravel that thread from the others for a bit of time before it would break. But what would one have? A limp thread to place under a magnifying glass. In my picture, all history is the tapestry. Does God have a plan? I believe he has. He himself has told us in his careful word that there is that which spoils his original creation, and that we have to wait until a final victory takes place to discover what perfection is like. However, although a battle continues and the consequences of the fall affect each of our lives in the world's history, yet God has not removed himself from the present portion of that battle. God is at work in history. Kings rise and fall. Dictators come and go, and end up hung upside down from lampposts. And how shall we then live? Francis Schaeffer says, there's a flow to history and to culture. He goes on to speak in that book about the wellspring that is in the thoughts of people. Y'all know that Francis is her husband, right? Edith's husband? Okay. People matter. People's ideas and actions matter. The tapestry of history is made up of people. The tapestry is not a pattern predetermined by God or by the devil. The tapestry is woven, blended, filled with events, ideas, devastating wars, catastrophic destruction, positive rebuilding, creative works, and practical inventions. History's going somewhere. The tapestry will have a moment of being completed and taken off the loom altogether. In the tapestry, this book, going to be an attempt to sketch all of history? No, a million times no. Nor will it be an attempt to take a piece of geography or a piece of time and to give a complete picture of that. It tries, however, to put a small magnifying glass on one tiny minuscule bit of the tapestry to see something of the way threads of lives are woven together, affecting each other and bringing forth creativity or events which otherwise might not have taken place. Can we unravel the mystery of our being, of our place in the tapestry? I think not. The very existence of each one of us involves the powerful reality of God's sovereignty. And at the same time, the very existence of each one of us involves the reality of an amazing number of choices made by an uncountable number of people in the centuries preceding our birth. Your birth, my birth. God can say, I knew you before the foundation of the world, and we can be comforted. We cannot demand to be given total understanding of the fact that choice is involved in the birth of each human being. Trust is a word that implies a scope of having trust in a person without knowing all the details of the situation in which the trust is needed. Really, to exhibit confidence in a person, we need to have situations following situations in which there is an element of the unknown. Believing without seeing, for which we are to be blessed, is not only believing in the existence of God, in his love and compassion, and in the truth of his promises, but it is actively and repeatedly showing confidence and trust in calling upon him, with a capital H, in our times of need, and expecting something to be different because we called. Do y'all believe that? Do you expect something to be different because we called on the name of the Lord? To be able to dissect and analyze and make a mathematical formula of what happens when we call for God's help is not what we are promised. God is God, and he remains God. We are human beings, and we remain human beings. We can have a relationship with, be children of, be friends of, come to know in a very real way the living God, creator of the universe. But our relationship, our friendship, our communication with him does not lift us out of the finite and make us a little bit infinite. A mystery of being remains. The mystery of existence remains. The mystery of life and death remains. This book is not an attempt to clear up the mysteries any more than it is to sketch all history. Rather, in this detail of the larger work, we may glimpse some of the weaving of people, time, and space, of choices and God's intervention, of hard work and answers to prayer, of mistakes and of amazing supplies of needs, of sickness and of health, of better and of worse. It also lets us see how God has taken weak things to confound the mighty, of how he can use even a stick of wood put into his hands. But most of all, it attempts to show that there is simply no human explanation for what we ourselves have observed and lived through in the last 32 years of our lives since the beginning of L'Abri. Do y'all know what L'Abri is? It's a place where Edith and Francis Schaeffer hosted tens and hundreds and maybe thousands of people to discuss God and life together. Nor, for that matter, is there one for what has happened to bring any of us into existence at our moment of history. The fact that Johann Sebastian Bach and John Bunyan have had more effect on us than they did on their contemporaries is all a part of the kind of understanding that may come from looking at one small bit of the tapestry and watching the threads form into design.
Thank you.
Today's motto.